Hello, everyone. This is Melanie, Yazzie, co-host of Red Power Hour. Elena and I are back for another regular episode. Want to say hi, Elena? We've both been on Indigenous journeys, going to dances and ceremonies since we last sat down here to record. So, trying to focus here. Maybe I wasn't supposed to say that we kind of had a little bit of a accident in terms of preparing for it today, but we're going to try to pull it together for everyone. But the focus of today's episode, so we're recording on June 9th, Friday, June 9th, 2023, is news that came out about a month ago, actually. Really incredible, historic. But Connie Walker, who is a Cree journalist from Okanisi First Nation in Treaty 6 territory, otherwise known as Saskatchewan in Canada, is the host, investigative journalist who hosts a podcast called Stolen. Stolen has 3 seasons so far. I believe the 3rd season is happening right now. The 3rd season came out in 2023. And the podcast won a Pulitzer Prize actually at the beginning of May, and also won a Peabody Award, which my understanding are the 2 most prestigious awards you can win in the world of journalism. Journalism, writing, etc. I guess Peabody just created its first podcast category for a win, and Stolen won it. And so we have been talking for a few weeks about, we've never reviewed another podcast before. That seems kind of strange, but I feel like Indigenous media, of course, Red Media, and kind of the Red Nation and the Red Nation podcast, which in its own way, I think has been very successful. I think it's influential. It provides an Indigenous left and feminist perspective that you may not get elsewhere. The world of Indigenous media, we talk a lot about reservation dogs. We do media reviews, both good and bad. It's really on an uptick. It's really actually exploded, I think, onto the mainstream in the US in a way that is unprecedented. And so we were thinking about this win by the Stolen podcast and by Connie Walker, and of course a First Nations woman, a Cree woman, as massively significant, I think, in terms of what Indigenous people are doing right now when it comes to media work. And so we listened to season 1 and season 2. Elena listened to season 1. I listened to season 2. And they're about very different topics. Season 1 is about MMIWG, basically in Montana, and season 2 is about a Catholic residential school. It's actually Connie Walker's family story that centers on her father's experience with abuse in a residential school in Treaty 6 territory. But yeah, we were just curious. I had not listened to the Stolen podcast. I knew other Native friends who had listened to it. I believe the first season was in 2021, the spring of 2021. So it's only a couple years old, the podcast. Not even quite as old actually as our podcast, because I think our first episode was in 2019 or something. So Red Nation podcast has been around for almost 4-ish years. I think the fall of 2019 was when we started our podcast. So we just wanted to listen to the podcast to see what is it that, the awards committees for these most prestigious ranking bodies in the world of journalism saw in the podcast, and to think through what are the implications of this for the future of Indigenous media, but also being a bit critical about how the awards, the recognition that's cast on this particular podcast, because it was for season 2 about residential schools. It wasn't for season 1 that the Pulitzer and the Peabody were given to Stolen and to Connie Walker. And there's actually a pretty stark difference between season 1 and season 2 in terms of topic and tone, I would say. And trying to think a little bit critically about why the reception for season 2 earned possibly the podcast these awards, and why season 1 didn't. So do you want to add anything, Elena? Or you can just hop right into giving us a synopsis of season 1 and we can go from there?
Yeah, I think it is interesting in just that both seasons, and I don't know what season 3 is focused on, but both seasons are about really very popular topics right now in the media: missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and relatives, and the boarding school thing have been in the news a lot, and both of them are very hard topics. You're dealing with people's pain, you're dealing with family pain, you're dealing with trauma. And so I listened to season 1, and it's about the disappearance of a young woman named Jermaine Charlo, who lives in Montana, and she's a member of the Kootenai Salish community. And I will say right off the bat, I've been to Montana, and I found it to be a really kind of a creepy place. And Connie Walker said the same thing when she walked into this bar where Jermaine Charlo was, where she had visited on the night she went missing. And she was there in the middle of the afternoon. And she interviewed one of the bartenders who knew Jermaine Charlo, and she's just giving her observations, and she's talking to this bartender who is confirming that it's a hard place to be an Indigenous woman. And she ends the session in the bar by saying, "I'm here in the middle of the day and I feel creeped out. Imagine what Jermaine Charlo felt." And she had worked there. She wasn't working the night she disappeared. She was actually a patron. But I listened to the whole thing, and a lot of things struck me. Number one is that these are all of our families. Like, she interviews Jermaine's grandmother, who is the one who really sent up the flares and said something needs to be done, that she had disappeared. She talks to the aunties, the mothers, the cousins, and there's this just cry for why isn't more being done about this issue. And in Montana, there's jurisdictional issues, just like there are on every other reservation across the country. There's the boyfriend who was not Native, so was not subject to the laws of the reservation, and then there's cross-jurisdictional issues between, is it a federal case, or is it tribal police, or is it state police, or the sheriff's department, which is county. And the bottom line was that nobody really did anything for days after this young woman had disappeared. Young mother, 2 children, and nothing was done until that window, has passed. And you hear the anguish from her grandmother and from her aunties and from her mother and from, all of these members of her family. And I can hear my own relatives. And when Connie Walker talks about them, she talks about these strong women, and she talks about literally every member of that family had been through some kind of violence in their life, some kind of trauma. And it's sexual violence, it's partner violence, it's both, it's all of them. And the statistics, we've talked about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls on this program. We've talked about missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. We've talked about all of this. And the statistics for violence against Native people, Native women in particular, are staggering. They're just staggering. And she repeated them. 84% of Native women at some point in their life encounter violence. They're subject to violence. 84%, and 1 in 2 are victims of sexual violence. So that's everything from from children all the way up until adulthood. 1 in 2 Native women are subject to sexual violence. And there was some places in the podcast that I sort of marked, because we have talked about this also. And Connie Walker talks about the fact that, from the very beginning of colonization, Christopher Columbus, in his journals, talks about looking for young Native women to give to his men and then to take back to Europe with him as sexual slaves. So 1492 is when this started happening to Native women. And since that moment in time, since the beginning of colonization, it has always been focused on white men abusing Native women. And that's sort of the premise of this, that she talks about being in this bar and she says, I feel really uncomfortable, and I always feel this way when there are a lot of white men around. And she talks about, of course, Montana in the big oil and gas boom and all of the man camps that were created, and how that really skyrocketed the rate of murdered and missing Indigenous relatives. And even now that has moved out of Montana, you still have the residual effects. You still have these white men, these predators around Native women, looking for Native women. So there was a lot in the podcast that I just found myself shaking my head and just saying, yep, this is like everywhere right now across Turtle Island where it's happening to Native women. I don't even know like what to say about that, other than it's interesting to hear it from a different area of the country and a different voice. And yet it echoed so much for me. People that we've talked to here, people that work, comrades that work in Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women. I mean, it's the same dialogue over and over and over again. And I recommend, that you listen to this podcast. I will tell you that there's not a happy ending. And that also is pretty typical of these cases. It's not a happy thing. It's depressing, and it's depressing because it's the same story. She has a boyfriend who's not Native, and he's abusive. And every single female relative or friend of Jermaine's that they talk to ends up telling their own story about how they were involved in a relationship that was abusive. And that happens all the time.
Thanks for that synopsis. My brain is working now because I'll just give a little synopsis of season 2 as a way to maybe segue into what I was thinking as you were talking. So season 2, I was wrong. I just looked at it again. There's only 2 seasons of the podcast. There's the one that Elena just described about this MMIW case in Montana, and then there's season 2, which is about actually about Connie Walker's own family. It's her father. She starts out the story with her father's experience with sexual abuse at a Catholic-run residential school called St. Michael's outside of Duck Lake in Saskatchewan, Treaty 6 territory. And so in season 2, which is 8 episodes long, Connie Walker speaks with a number of her own family members. Her father passed away about a decade ago. So there's some archival audio footage that's spliced in of her father speaking. But she speaks with many people from her father's generation. Most of her family went to this residential school. They were stolen, right? That's the name of the podcast. And incarcerated at this residential school, this Catholic-run residential school. And virtually all of them, it turns out, you find out in the course of the season, were sexually abused by nuns and priests, right? Because this was a Catholic run residential school, St. Michael's. And so, she goes and she interviews one of the priests. His name is Father Gautier. It sounds like many of them were from Quebec. So they were French Canadian. And Father Gautier is like 96 or something. He's very old, and she finds him in a nursing home. And, she goes and she interviews him. Father Gautier was, her own relatives, including one of her uncle. If I recall correctly, it was her father as well. That Father Gautier was their abuser. They named him, and he explicitly denies it. The Oblates, I think is how it's pronounced. I don't know anything about the Catholic Church and how it organizes itself, but I believe the Oblates is like the regional representative of that order for the Catholic Church, right? That distributes members into residential schools to do the work, right, of the Catholic Church in a particular region of the world. And the leader of the Oblates takes no responsibility, for, I believe it was like 46 nuns and priests who were named in documents by First Nations individuals who testified in the 90s and early 2000s as part of Canada's larger process of truth and reconciliation. I forgot what the actual official process was called. I apologize. I listened to the entire podcast coming home from like an intense kind of like community event too, and so I was driving and like my mind was back in the community, and then I was listening to like this horrific podcast about this, also like extremely graphic about what actually happened to this Indigenous woman's own family, and she's narrating this in the podcast. And so it was a pretty yoded moment, honestly, to listen to it as I was coming back to Minnesota Makoche in my car. But she's trying to find, she has to go around the Catholic Church, but then also kind of the Canadian state to find particularly her father, because he named his abuser. But she's like, I actually want to know who did this to my father. And she is able to find it, as well as, the named abuser of other family members and other First Nations kids who were sexually abused at St. Michael's, at this particular Catholic run residential school. But the Catholic Church essentially takes no responsibility for it. And most of these people, most of the accused abusers are dead now. Father Gautier is one of two who's still alive. I think out of the 46, if I recall, and she names them. That's it. That's also, I think, what was really important. She named the nuns and the priests who were in these documents from testimony. She named them as people who had been accused of sexually abusing, not just, and I mean, physical abuse was also something that was very heavily detailed in the series, but the sexual abuse, these individuals were named as sexual abusers of First Nations kids in St. Michael's residential school. And so the second season is kind of like one part commentary on an issue that I think has also risen to the foreground, kind of at the national and the international level, in relationship to kind of justice for ongoing colonialism. Obviously, I'm talking about residential and boarding schools, but it's done so and refracted through the personal story of Connie Walker's family, which is, I'm not going to lie, it's actually like pretty uncomfortable to listen to because it is so highly personal, quite intimate, I would say. And obviously, as like another Native person listening to it, I'm like, I don't know if I would, make a podcast series talking about my own family, and our experiences with gender and sexual violence. So that's what season 2 is about. And it's my understanding is that season 2, about St. Michael's residential school and about her family, the personal story of her family, gender and sexual violence in her family, is the season that won the Pulitzer and the Peabody. It wasn't season 1, about this MMIW case in Montana. So the reason why I wanted to describe all that before I made my comment is that it's interesting that, so the podcast is called Stolen, right? And so you have one season looking at MMIWG, and you have another season looking at essentially the theft of Indigenous children by the residential school system in Canada. And so both, right? So you think about kids, you think about children, you think about women and girls being stolen, right? They're stolen, like land, right? I think there's a lot that's been persuasively written about how the theft of children, who are the literal future of our indigenous nations, but then also the theft and the murder of women, who are, I mean, I think it's a cliche to say that they're the backbone of our nations, but it's also true, right? That these most valued members of our nations, and kind of in our customary forms of governance and belonging and kinship, that the removal or the theft of those people, those important relatives from our communities and from our families, is a systematic effort, right, to gut our nations, to bring us to our knees so that we can't exist anymore. We can't defend land, right? We can't practice any meaningful form of sovereignty. It's genocide. In one word, it's genocide. Both of these, both MMIWG, right, and the horrific theft of Indigenous children into residential and boarding schools is a form of genocide. And so genocide is, like people debate whether or not that's a term that you should use to describe these things. I'm not really interested in debating something like that. It's pretty obvious to me. Uh, and genocide by nature is predatory, right? And so Canada and the United States, if you're looking at MMIW, right, and you're looking at residential schools hand in hand and side by side, you're looking at predation, whether it's preying on Indigenous women to where you can't even walk into a public space in Montana without feeling unsafe. You're like, this place is really creepy. I don't want to be here. Or you're an Indigenous child, just literally just living with your parents, and then like the Canadian nation state and the Catholic Church comes in and literally just takes you out of your home with no explanation, and then beats you every night, and then sexually abuses you, and then churns you back out and expects you to, you know, try to live a life, right? As an Indigenous person, and to kind of reintegrate back into what you were before that, because you're utterly transformed by the violence, by genocide, right? By the violence of that experience. And so what I think Stolen describes is just the predatory nature of settler colonialism, maybe across both seasons.
And heteropatriarchy. I mean,
Exactly. And that predation happens primarily through gender violence, gender and sexual violence, primarily, because both seasons are about gender and sexual violence.
yeah, and the Catholic Church as both the force behind much of the world's colonization and much of the world's gendered violence. The Catholic Church has been at the center of so much violence against Indigenous peoples all over the world, and just to hear what you said about how they refuse to acknowledge, that this happened, and they refuse to take responsibility for it, is just, you know, my family, I have a lot of family who's Catholic or who pretend to be Catholic. And I was raised Catholic because everybody in the Pueblos is raised Catholic. And I left abandoned, rejected when I was very young. Um, and I look at it, and it almost blows my mind that people still adhere to that church, still believe in that church, when literally they have single-handedly committed genocide against our people for years, generations. When Connie Walker was talking about Columbus, well, who was Columbus sailing for? Spain. Why was Spain seeking to colonize? Because they had just basically reclaimed their country from the Moors, from the North Africans, from Muslims, and they wanted to Catholicize literally the entire world. That was their goal, aside from becoming incredibly wealthy from stealing everybody's land. So from 1492, when sex trafficking of Native women literally began in this hemisphere, and to the Catholic boarding schools, to MMIW, it's always been about settler colonialism, about which is driven by the church. The church drives government, and it's these governments that manifest destiny was a divine mandate, right? Or supposedly manifest destiny was a divine mandate. And we were talking earlier about how the Pope supposedly repudiated the doctrine of discovery. But he really didn't. And he really, you have to name those papal bulls, and you have to call them out, and you have to say, this was literally an evil document that was passed by the Catholic Church. And we reject it. We should have rejected it, years ago. And he didn't really do that. He just kind of circled around the back, peeked in the back door, and said, yeah, you're right. It was a bad idea. None of this ever came with any kind of remuneration or any harm reduction. Like, none of this ever came with anything substantive. No apology has ever come close to reducing the amount of harm done by the Catholic Church. And the fact that nobody ever took responsibility. I mean, these are horrific. I've read some of the transcripts of children, and I didn't listen to this podcast, but I can't even do it. It is so disturbing and so just, you wonder, as you're walking and living in this world, how human beings can be so awful. And this church managed to grab every single one of them and put a collar on them or a dress or something and say, yeah, go do this all to Native kids. Here's your carte blanche, go do it. Anyway, nobody should ever be in any doubt about how I feel about the Catholic Church. And, when I talk about burning it all down, again, just want to say, Sina, I'm not talking about burning churches. I'm talking about burning down settler colonialism.
Well, I forgot what year it was. It must have been maybe in the early 2000s. Someone did burn St. Michael's to the ground. Connie Walker talks about this a couple of times. And in her interviews with, she has memories of her dad, for example, how he would have these PTSD flashbacks that she later understood to be related to the physical structure of the school, the stairs leading up to the entrance, the windows of the school. And I believe it's either one of her aunts or her uncle also talks about the sounds of that building. So the physical, the actual edifice, right, the physical building itself would trigger really horrific nightmares, really horrific episodes for survivors of the school. So burning it down was like an incredibly important, moment in just getting rid of the visual representation of complete terror and complete horror for this literally an entire generation. And more than one generation. St. Michael's didn't even close until 1996. That was really recent. That was like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, And a lot of residential and boarding schools closed down maybe in the 60s, but, in the United States, some of them were still running into the 70s and the 80s. And then obviously the residential schools in Canada into the 90s. And so, what I'm saying is that burning down an actual school, everyone talk about church burning, which is a venerated tradition of my clan, by the way. That's part of where that history comes from. The burning actually of a Catholic church in a pueblo because of the violence of conquest that we're describing here. The permission, like what you said, Elena, about how can people do this to each other? How could you possibly do this to a child, like a 3-year-old child or like a 5-year-old child? And the incredible like permission that the structure and the system of colonialism and conquest gives you to do this. And whether it's, you're lying to yourself that you're saying it's in the name of religion, all that doesn't come from religion. That comes from the mentality that these are animals, right? These are animals that must be submissive, and that you have to either beat or kill, right? In order to get the end goal is either to convert them for the rest of their lives. And if you can't convert them, then you just get rid of them. And that really is what describes colonialism. The Catholic Church is a protagonist in North America, well, in the entire Western Hemisphere, of conquest and what I just described. And apologies don't matter. I know we're like in the neoliberal era of apologia, right? And like this idea that like a recognition of the harm, or kind of like a recognition of the trauma and then an apology for the trauma. It's like, oh, we're going to close this dark chapter. Aren't they always saying this is like dark chapter in our national history? And it's like, okay, but the reason why people are still making documentaries about MMIWG in Montana, like there was a new one that came out on Showtime this year, just like 2 or 3 months ago, is because colonialism isn't like, conquest isn't a thing that just happened in the past. It's a structure, right? Which I feel like is a normal, like most people understand that this is true in this day and age, but the impulse to apologize and then to be like, oh, that's the form of justice that we need, and then to move forward, obviously misses the point that the mentality that Native people, particularly children and women who are seen as more vulnerable by that predatory system that underwrites conquest, are still subjected to the logic of the doctrine of discovery, which is a logic that sees Native people as animals, and that whether or not we're trying to live our best lives, living out in public, going to a bar like any normal person to have a drink, or like trying to raise our kids, or engaging in like resistance, like being a water protector, for example, or being a feminist, or those kinds of things, that obviously we're seen as a threat. We're seen as out of control. We're seen as out of place. And there are just a litany of mechanisms of control and discipline and torture, really, in the arsenal of conquest that are still very much unleashed on Native people every day. And today we're just talking about them in the form of MMIWG, right? That's the language we use today to talk about it. But the fact that 84% of Native women experience, was it violence?
84% experience abuse.
Experience abuse in their lifetime.
And 1 in 2 is sexual violence. 1 in 2 is subjected to sexual violence.
Those statistics demonstrate that conquest is so deeply integrated into like our everyday lives and our everyday experiences as Native people, that we really need to be doing work, right, to undo the structure. The structure is really powerful when it literally dominates like the horizon of your everyday life and your every waking moment. That's when it's powerful. And I think it's the world of it's partly the work of media, like kind of what we do here, right? To pull back that veil and to really expose the prevalence and like what's going on, so that we understand deeply that it's a structure and it's a system, and therefore the change also needs to be structural, and it also needs to be systemic. And like, I know we're not supposed to swear on the podcast, but like, fuck your apology. Like, your apology quite literally means nothing, or your repudiation of the doctrine of discovery means absolutely nothing, because conquest has not ended, and the only thing that will end conquest is decolonization.
And then the calling out of, there were some places in the first season where I literally stopped and I had to think. I paused the podcast, and we have talked about the hypersexualization of Native people, the Pocahontas thing, and And there was a lot of discussion in the podcast about um, how attractive Jermaine was, and both the detective that is one of the primary um, interview with the person she interviews, or she's with a lot during the on the podcast. um he brings it up a lot. She was very attractive, she knew how to put on her makeup, she took care of herself. And I stopped at that point and thought to myself, would 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 this guy be saying the same thing if it was a white woman? Like, and is what he's saying that because she took care of herself, because she dressed well and knew how to put on makeup, that she'd somehow, that's not allowed, and that she was somehow asking for it? This was during a segment where they were discussing whether or not Jermaine was trafficked, because there was trafficking taking place in the area, sex trafficking and drug trafficking. But so, is the fact that she was attractive and that she was at a bar, does that somehow um, make it more reasonable that this would have happened to her? Like, she was asking for it, and that's so typical in rape cases. Is, when you have women dressing provocatively, that's the reason why they were raped. But for when you take it and when you look at Native women, like, the very fact that she was at a bar and that she knew how to put on makeup somehow made it more likely that this was going to happen to her. And then at one point he says, he stops and he says, well, yeah, she was very attractive, and traffickers look for that kind of women. And, I know I'm a man. And I just went, like, what the fuck does that mean? I mean, I'm a man, therefore it's like inherent in you to want to do this to a young woman?
Or like, is he saying like, oh, I understand now why she was targeted? Like,
Yeah,
as a man, like, I can tell that she's a what the actual fuck?
yeah, yep. And yeah, that was
Sick.
pretty sick.
Sick.
I just, yeah. Mm.
And it's also sick. Now I'm getting mad.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, what the actual fuck? If your religion and like the entire premise of your concept of political organization is just sick, and you all just like pretend and allow that sickness to be normal, and then not just normal, but you act as if it's like the pinnacle of civilization.
Mm-hmm.
I I don't know what to say about that. There's nothing redeeming about a system like that.
Nope.
That's just that describes settler colonialism, and for the most part that describes like US nationalism.
Yep. Yep.
Ugh.
Yeah.
And
And
Christianity.
it's, yeah, Christianity, particularly Catholicism. Like, I don't care, what your belief system is. I mean, if you want to believe in Daddy OJC and the spook, that's fine. It's the structure of the Catholic Church, and it's the men in the Catholic Church. Yes, I realize that there are nuns historically who have been abusers, but it's that heteropatriarchal structure that has created that system of abuse and allowed that system of abuse. And if you still believe that the Catholic Church is somehow beneficent, then there is something really fucking wrong with you, because it is the most despicable organization on earth, and it has done the most harm and subjected our people to the most violence. And when you're talking about a child, you're talking about someone who has done nothing to you. Even if a child is having a temper tantrum or a meltdown, as children do. That is not what you do to children. And it's, I just can't even, you know, I can't even fathom what would cause someone to think that that was okay. That sexually abusing a child was okay. It's unfathomable. And, you know, so I'm gonna talk about Taylor Sheridan, um,
Go for
because
it.
because we've talked about um, 1883, and then I think at some point we're going to do a review of 1923, which is the one that has Harrison Ford and Helen Mirren in it, and there is a sub story about a young Indigenous woman, um, and it is her, I'm guessing, descendant who is the current chief of the unnamed tribe in Yellowstone, in the show that started the whole thing. But she is taken away and to a boarding school and subject to horrific abuse and sexual abuse, and ultimately, um, good for her, she kills a bunch of people, including the ones who abused her. And I mean, to me, watching it was really, it was just trauma porn, and it was, it was, of course, written for the male gaze, and so it made me sick and uncomfortable and angry and disgusted. Um, but this is marketable right now, like, which is gross. And missing and murdered Indigenous women, childhood, Catholic school, boarding school abuse, has been in the news. MMIW has been in the news. I mean, there was an entire show based around it, um, Alaska Daily, about a missing and murdered Indigenous woman in so-called Alaska, and they based a whole season around it. And um, so it's in the media. It's popularized right now. It's made consumable by mass media. So after understanding that 1 in 2 Indigenous women is subject to sexual violence in their life, 84% of us are subject to abuse, to then have it turned around and made a media event, and to have it broadcast, I just don't know how I feel about that.
So, yeah. Um, this speaks to something I noticed between the first season and the second season of Stolen. So the first season is about MMIWG, and the second season is about residential schools. Of course, we know in Canada, given the last 25 years, that the quote unquote revelations, or right, the sharing of the experience with gender and sexual violence and just violence in general in residential schools created the entire truth and reconciliation machinery of the Canadian settler state. And, I feel like on the US side of things, we're kind of in the fits and starts at the beginning of that. The Department of the Interior, under Deb Haaland's leadership, issued the first report of its kind on the history of federal Indian boarding schools just about a year ago. I think it was in May of 2022. But so, like, as you said, Elena, this is very much in the news. It's kind of part of the popular discourse. But the fact that the media establishment, meaning I'm assuming the people who select the recipients of the Pulitzer or the recipients of the Peabody, they're part of the cultural shifts that are happening around these things, right? And we're living in a time where I said earlier, like, fuck your apology. We're living in a time of grand apologies, of apologia. And that's part of this kind of liberal, like what you're saying, Elena, it's the liberal response, and liberal not in terms of like a Democrat. I mean, liberal is in terms of liberalism, which is the predominant political tendency of, the United States, for example. Liberalism, like the kind of liberalism that was created in like the 17th century, for example, Enlightenment kind of stuff. And so it's an expression of liberalism where we are today in a political climate where both the social capital, but all types of capital, but certainly like the social capital in which media usually trades in, talking social commentary or political commentary. Social capital is now attached to injury, right? The identities based on injury, the sharing of stories of injury. And so this is just part of like the neoliberal kind of economy, the discursive economy that we're in right now. And I talked about this in relationship, I think, to pretendianism, if I recall. I did a breakdown of injury, neoliberal injury politics. And so anyway, I feel like understanding how neoliberal injury politics operates gives us an understanding of why the selection committees for these two prestigious awards probably would have awarded those that recognition of injury to season two versus season one, because season two is Connie Walker's personal story. It's something that, if frankly, as someone who was listening, felt almost like invasive in a way. And I'm not saying that that was her intention, but I, as a listener, I felt like a voyeur, to be honest with you. That's how I felt. And it was really uncomfortable. And yet I persisted in listening because I was like, this won these awards. There has to be a reason. Like, I want to make it through this entire season so that I can reflect on why this was recognized in such a way in 2023 to be the pinnacle, really. I mean, that's what that represents to me, right? That this story of her father and literally everyone in her family and herself included as survivors of like colonial gender and sexual violence, that this is considered by the establishment, the media establishment, as the pinnacle of Indigenous media and Indigenous storytelling. And I think it has to do with neoliberal injury politics, the economies around injury-based identities and the social capital and the political capital that is attached to that. This includes like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the debates about that happening. It's part of like the larger pushback against, I would say, trans identity and Black Lives Matter that's happening from the extreme right in the United States, right? It's very complicated and it's very messy. And again, I'm not saying that Connie Walker intended to do this, but I'm just saying that I think that that season was received in a particular way because it was legible within this kind of larger economy of neoliberal injury politics. And that doesn't, that kind of recognition of injury doesn't do anything structural, right? It doesn't do the things we need it to do to really push back against and to dismantle colonial gender violence, which is really like what the issue is. And that colonialism can't happen without gender and sexual violence. Like, that's how conquest does its work. And so how do we, who do media work, the media is important for bringing these issues to light, but how do we continue to push past, right? The really seductive and the really normative impulse of neoliberalism to recognize injury politics, to apologize, to throw some money at the issue, some money or some awards at the problem, and then to just continue to bulldoze over Indigenous land and Indigenous futures, and to continue to completely ignore and erase Indigenous people. So,
and I think like I I wouldn't even think about questioning why Connie Walker did this. I mean, we all
not at all.
deal with trauma in different ways.
It's incredibly brave, actually, that she did
It
this.
is, and I don't know that I would ever do anything like that with my family if I had that in my family. I just to me, it's almost a re-injury. It's opening up the wound again. And her father was gone, so and obviously, he had talked about it. I know many, many more people in my family and extended family who simply will not talk about it. They just won't.
I
And
don't blame them.
yeah, and I think, you know listening to you talk about it, it just, like, the image that comes to my mind is just a body splayed out on an autopsy table and being cut open, because that's what it feels like. That, this pain, and I feel this way about both seasons of this podcast, like the pain that a family goes through dealing with a missing child, regardless of how old the child is, and or a missing family member. If it's your sister or your cousin or your niece or your grandchild, the pain that you go through as an individual and as a family, and then to have it made public. And you have to make it public if you want the attention to help find the individual. And in most cases, it doesn't work. In most cases of MMIWG, they don't find them, and or if they do, they're no longer alive. And I think about what Connie Walker's family must have gone through, and the multi-generational sexual violence, and coming out and putting that out there on display. Maybe it was cathartic, maybe it was healing for her to do that. But why is that consumed so readily and happily by
And celebrated. Actually, that's the word. It's
yeah,
celebrated.
yep, yep. So we have been colonized, we have been genocided, we have had our cultures and our language and our land destroyed and stolen. And in the 21st century, we are dealing with the revelations about the boarding schools that have become fairly commonplace in the last decade or two, and the murder of missing Indigenous women, which is in the media. So this is the second wave of genocide and destruction that Native people have gone through. The first one being, starting in 1492. And now, instead of being hidden in the shadows by the Catholic Church or by, white men, now it's coming out, and it's just a second victimization. It's just a second way of dehumanizing us. And it's really disturbing. I wonder, like you said, Mel, like, how do we own this to to an extent that we can encourage move towards structural change? Like, it's not enough for it to be trauma porn. We need to, like, turn it into a mechanism for structural change. And I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking, like the Red Nation, I mean, this is the Red Nation podcast, right? And the Red Nation is a different beast than like Red Media. Media is like a tool. In my perspective, media is a tool to help to like speak to, nourish movements, to provide political education, to create a platform for, a platform to, and this is why we created Red Media, right? A platform for Indigenous voices that's by and for Indigenous people, but that also has a very central political commitment and an understanding that we're here to build and to cultivate and to nourish and to grow and advance Indigenous movements for decolonization and liberation. And so media is like really limited. It's a really limited thing, I guess. And social media in particular, I think, has created this notion that somehow the media work itself is a type of activism, or that like the media work is going to do really remarkable things when it comes to like material change, or like our very identities as radicals or as activists, or I don't know. I'm not even just talking about the left, because the right does it too. That our very identities as people who are agents of social and political change, um, in the media is like representative of the work itself. And I'm not sure I'm articulating this right, because I think a lot about this. And media doesn't do that. Like, I don't think that that's what media is. And so I think there's a reason why the disclosure of Indigenous pain is so celebrated. We're like at peak neoliberalism, I think, when it comes to like settler colonialism right now, where it's like really like truly what you were saying made me this phrase in my mind, that the disclosure of Indigenous pain is celebrated. That's like the pinnacle of recognition, liberal recognition, neoliberal recognition politics when it comes to injury. And media plays an important role in that, right? Because that's where the disclosure happens. Sometimes the disclosure happens in the halls of power through like testifying in Congress, or, you know, in front of these various like committees of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the state of Canada. But a lot of it now happens in media. There's like been just an explosion of documentaries and docuseries and things like that about MMIWG, for example, like Stolen, like the podcast we're talking about. And so what I'm trying to say is, maybe we should stop disclosing Indigenous pain. Like maybe it's time to close the chapter on that disclosure. And in the work we do in media, and instead, with media, we just have a different philosophy and an approach to how media is a tool within our larger toolbox for building movements that are the only way, right? We say this in the Red Deal and the Red Nation. Mass politicians can never do what only mass movements can do. And that's what we should be focusing our energy on, especially when we're doing media work, right? Is building those mass movements that can create that kind of historical change. I mean, many of us have seen that historical change happen in our lifetime, even with just recent uprisings and Standing Rock and such. And so that's just what it made me think of. It's an idea or like a critique or an intervention that's still developing in my mind. So I'm just kind of thinking out loud here as I'm saying this. But maybe the disclosure of pain is not politically useful anymore, is basically what I'm saying.
And I agree.
It's not necessary, and it's not even useful at this point for advancing the movement.
And I think it keeps us stuck in just this victimization mode, whether it's other people who are looking at us and calling us, victims. Oh, you poor thing, and wringing their hands and crying crocodile tears, when actually it was, the systems that their ancestors established that are creating the pain to begin with. I don't like. I'd be much more comfortable torching a church than talking about transgenerational trauma. I mean, that's just the way I feel. I want to be moving forward. I want to be active. I want to like feel like what I'm doing is moving the movement forward, moving the revolution, getting the revolution closer. And so I don't necessarily want to talk about trauma and pain. And I think it's, if that's what the public is clamoring for, then fuck them. Like, we should be talking about the strength of our people and how we have survived despite all of this. and not what happened and who's apologized for it. Like, fuck the church, fuck heteropatriarchy, and fuck the extractive industries and the man camps and all that. We need to take care of our sisters and ourselves and our mothers and our kids. And I'm just tired of you talked earlier, Mel, about how many podcasts are about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and how many are focused on, the docu-series, the documentaries, now the it being added into mainstream, like, network TV. I don't know how I feel about that. Like,
Yeah, yeah. You arrive back at the same place where you're like, I'm not sure how I feel about that.
yeah,
And and I'm not sure how I feel about that from, like, as a person who is politically invested. Like, this is a political podcast, right? Like, a person who has a very clear, who's invested in analyzing things politically for, like, their relevance and their importance politically to the struggle and the movement for Native liberation. That's always how I'm thinking about the things we talk about on this podcast. And I mean, yes, personally, I have my own feelings about that, but my personal feelings are really not as important, I think, as, like, my political analysis of something, because that's my contribution, hopefully, to the movement, right? Is to think through that, and I'm not obviously saying that healing isn't important. Like God, just the violence is so extreme, and even listening to season 2 of Stolen, like, every single person in Connie Walker's family has experienced this horrific abuse, and you're like, holy shit, how do we heal from this when it's been like 3, 4, 5 generations of our families? And so then how do you change, right? And then how do you heal truly? That's a real question. That said, right, and that's important work, and I'm glad there are people in our communities doing that work. I have had to do plenty of that work myself. Okay, so I'm not. Oftentimes, people think when I'm critiquing neoliberal injury politics, I'm critiquing their actual trauma, and that's not what I'm doing. I'm talking about how trauma in the public sphere, particularly Indigenous trauma and Indigenous pain in the public sphere, becomes something politically interesting. And then once that happens, then all of this crazy stuff happens because of that. And people from lots of political tendencies with lots of different agendas are going to be appropriating that pain and that trauma for different ends. And that's when things get messy. And that's when you have to have a political analysis. It's strange to say, but you have to have a political analysis of your own pain, right? Because the pain in and of itself that's not political in that same way. I mean, it is because it's a result of colonialism or heteropatriarchy, but it becomes political because of the way that it gets caught up within, like, the systems, like, of liberalism or capitalism, like the consumption of pain, for example. Anyway, that's all I'm saying. And just being more critical about that, especially those of us who do media work, you know, like, having a philosophy of media as an Indigenous media person, like a content producer, where we're thinking more critically about the disclosure of pain. And, like, I mean, also because of the new agey stuff, the disclosure of, like, culture and spirituality, and how that goes really, that goes to really weird places, um, real quick, because of, like, where we are, you know, because of settler colonialism and liberalism.
you were mentioning earlier also, I mean, I'm thinking about, what are the material conditions um, that, I mean, we've talked about the material conditions that have created these various, the Catholic Church and extractive industries. You talked about how many of these podcasts about MMIWG are centered on Montana.
Yeah, so I mean, I watch a lot of the stuff and I listen to a lot of the stuff about MMIWG just because, first of all, it's a real thing, right? That's happening that we need to address. And I want to hear what people are saying about it. I want to understand it better. But Up and Vanished, which is like one of the OG true crime podcasts, it's hosted by someone named Payne Lindsay and Tenderfoot Productions. But Up and Vanished, I think it was their first season. I forgot what year that was, but they actually solved a murder case with the podcast, right? And so this thing with some of these true crime podcasts where they actually solved real cold cases became like a sensation in the world of podcasting. And then all of these other podcasts cropped up to do this. And so Up and Vanished did an entire season. Season 3 in 2021 was about Ashley Loring Heavy Runner, I believe is her name. And that was an MMIWG case in Montana. NBC News just last year, maybe the year before, also did a feature documentary through Datelines, the Vanished series, on MMIWG, a number of MMIWG cold cases in Montana. And then I didn't even know this, I haven't watched this yet, but a brand new docuseries, partly produced, I think, and directed by Indigenous folks, came out on Showtime this year called Murder in Bighorn, also taking place in Montana. And then, of course, the first season of Stolen is documenting MMIWG case in Montana. So I'm not sure. So you were saying, Elena, that like Albuquerque and Seattle have actually the highest rates of MMIWG in the country, correct? New Mexico has the
Yep.
highest as the state, correct?
Per capita. Yep. But
Per
those are
capita.
per capita statistics. And yeah, it's Seattle and Albuquerque are the two top cities. New Mexico, I think, is up in the top 5 for states. And
Okay.
considering the population, that's high.
I haven't looked at MMIWG statistics in a beat, but I'm not saying, okay, right? So I'm just trying to think about like what is happening with media attention on MMIWG in this one place, even though MMIWG speaks to and as a result of the structure of colonial gender violence that underwrites all of settler colonialism everywhere, right? Obviously, those numbers are going to be higher where there's a higher concentration of actual Native people and like actual Native women and girls, right? And relatives. But I it feels, I guess, and again, this is me thinking out loud. I don't have some sort of conclusive analysis of this. I just noticed it because of like the media that I consume about this issue. It's like the media swarms, they swarm around something when it seems to be a story or like it seems to be like interesting. And I'm talking about the non-native media that's been produced about MMIWG in Montana. I was looking at the timeline, and actually, I think Stolen, right, which is an Indigenous produced podcast, was the first media outlet to do a story on a feature story on MMIWG in Montana. And then NBC followed, and then Up and Vanished followed, and then Showtime followed. And so it's like, do you get what I'm saying? It's like a trend. It's like basically media treats it like a trend. And MMIWG is not a fucking trend. It's not like something's that's just like interesting all of a sudden politically to people. And then they're like, oh, we need to raise some money and like shoot some documentaries about this shit. Like, that's not what that is. And no one who is like done the history of organizing around MMIWG would ever treat it that way. It's about the very future of our people. It's about the very structure of our nations. It is about colonialism itself. And so I didn't listen to season 1 of Stolen Podcast. I'm sure that it treats the case, I hope provides a structural analysis or goes back and forth between the case itself and the story, and then, tracing it through the larger structure of colonial gender violence that creates MMIWG in the first place. But yeah, this weird like media swarming around Indigenous issues where we're just treated as a trend. At least, I mean, we're something else. I don't know. You get what I'm saying? It's just like absurd. It's like all of a sudden we're like the hot topic for 2021 and 2022, and then, they just move on to something else.
Exactly. It's like one year you're going to see 15 different primetime television shows on lawyers, law firms, and then the next year it's all on hospitals. And all of a sudden we're getting MMIW, and it's really not the same thing. Like, let's be really clear here. Um, this co-opting of um, real human conditions, real material conditions on the ground in reservations in towns, border towns, around reservations, is not something you should be taking and consuming and making it consumable for popular culture, right? These two things are not the same. And yet that's what seems to be happening. And if they come out with a TV show about boarding school, I mean, they did. Taylor Sheridan did it. But
Oh,
not the
fucking
main
Taylor Sheridan.
Taylor Sheridan, man.
Stop! Because he did Wind River too, which was like the first major, media fictional account of MMIWG in like the history of American pop culture.
And it was super
Just a white
trauma
guy.
porn. Yeah. I mean, there was, and the scenes, like, and again, boy, I could get into this, but like the white male gaze, the way he creates that content is all, and it's the same. It was literally the same shot in Wind River as it is in 1923 of, a traumatized, naked teenage girl from the rear. And yeah, it's just, yeah, so it's gross. And don't, like, I guess that's what I'm saying is, like, don't take that and make it something for the consumer market. It really, that's not the place for it. Because then motherfuckers like Taylor Sheridan are going to take this shit and make TV shows about it.
Some of the most popular TV shows in the history of television, actually.
Yeah. And I think, and he makes it acceptable to the mainstream audience because, I mean, like, I'm just reflecting back on the fact that Connie Walker talked about her father and the abuse that he, and then you mentioned the uncle, and the sexual abuse that they endured. Taylor Sheridan makes it acceptable by making it teenage girls, because they are, already sexualized by the media. Now, I don't think he would have been able to do the same thing had it been a young child boy. So it's it's not okay.
And again, right, it's not about who is like sharing the story. It's not about who controls the narrative. It's the narratives that gain traction and then become like celebrated, or they're the narratives that already play into the sensationalization of colonial gender and sexual violence, because that's at the center of like the pathology of settler colonialism and settler heteropatriarchy. And those are the narratives, even if they're well intentioned, that will gain traction, that will win awards, and that will make the careers of white men like Taylor Sheridan. And so, what do we do given this understanding? I really think we should not participate in it, and we should pivot. And this is maybe one of the reasons why I'm now understanding, like, my own perspective, or maybe our perspective on Red Power Hour better. Why we like celebrate reservation dogs a lot is because it doesn't do any of this. The narrative and the things that show is interested in are not only as real, as colonial gender and sexual violence, but uh, important. Those narratives are important, like you said, and they're about like the humor and the strength and the resilience and the silliness, the contradictions of everyday native life, the quirkiness, the sweetness, like those types of things. Um, And so it's important, right? It's important to be aware of like the larger context in which your narrative will be received, maybe before you make it, utilizing media. And that's like a political choice that you should make. As you know, that's a choice you should make and follow through on. And I maybe haven't always done it, but I'm much more aware now than I used to be about it.
And yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, well, I'm just going to say, this has been very dark. Like thinking about both these things has been very dark. And, um, but I was super excited. So I'm going to share this because I was super excited that, um, a native chef won the James Beard Award for the first time, a female, a woman chef, um, Sherry Pocknet, in Rhode Island,
Wampanoag.
Wampanoag, um, who I have to go back east occasionally for work, and I've been wanting, like, it's been on my list for several years to go. She has a place called the Sly Fox Den, and um, she's the first native chef to win a James Beard Award. Other um, restaurants and cookbooks and other things have won James Beard Award native, but she's the first chef. And like I, I, I just want to bring that up because I think those are the things that get me through the day. Like, yes, we talked about with Sean Sherman. We talked about
Owambi.
his restaurant, and we talked about like all of a sudden how indigenous cuisine is being spotlighted, and I think those are the things that we want media to focus on, and we want to have spotlighted because it does focus more on our um, actual presence in the world and our hopes for the future, and that's what we need to focus on.
It's like an affirmation instead of a negation, you know? Like indigeneity is not a negation. It's not. It's, I mean, really, if you boil it down, like indigenous lifeways are purely affirmative because they're like future oriented, pretty much at their core. And yeah, I would love, let's celebrate indigenous excellence. Like, let's celebrate that.
And it's like Comrade Nick says, our history is the future.
And
So let's celebrate that in a positive way.
and approach injustice in a very critical and a careful way. I think in terms of like, you know, our politics and how we do this work and how we remain committed to Indigenous futures. So, well, thanks everyone for listening. You truly went on a journey with us in this conversation. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. I'm not sure. We have a lot of content ideas. I'm not sure what's going to happen next. We might do a book review. Might try to get Ramona Emerson back on the podcast. I just remembered we needed to do that because our other recording didn't go through. But yeah,
At some point, we will completely trash Taylor Sheridan.
I feel like we did that. Okay. So I'm getting ready. I'm ready now that the summer season is here to fucking watch Yellowstone. Okay, I don't know. I forgot that 1923 existed. The prospect of having to watch another show makes me want to, cry. But I mean, maybe this could just be the summer of trashing Taylor Sheridan. Creepy. Just anyway. Just making an entire industry out of the portrayal of indigenous suffering. What a fucking asshole.
And the elevation of this, Western idealized white man, and how he's from John Wayne on, I that figure, like the Marlboro Man, John Wayne, now Kevin Costner, is just so horrific, and just dissecting what that is. and why it's like a zombie that keeps coming back to life. Like Westerns are cyclic. We see a lot of Westerns, then they seem to die down, and then they come back. And it's like,
Die, zombie, die.
yeah, regeneration through violence. It's just, yeah.
I mean, yeah, isn't that the story of America?
Yep. But if you are listening and you're somewhere back east, go to the Sly Fox Den and eat some food and celebrate Indigenous cuisine.
Aw, that's a good way to end. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everyone.